My name is Jane Korn, and I have the privilege of being Dean at Gonzaga University School of Law. I want to, before we start the 7th annual Quackenbush lecture, I want to just take a moment to thank the generosity of the judges from the Eastern District of Washington for sponsoring this lecture, now in its 7th year, and acknowledge Judge Quackenbush, in whose honor this lecture is held. And welcome to the law school. I have now been ordered by the U.S. Marshals to ask you to turn your phones off. That does not mean silence. Silence is not sufficient. Completely off, please. According to the U.S. Marshals. So we know we need to follow their directions. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tom Rice, who is an alum and who is the Chief Judge for the Eastern District.
Thank you, Dean Korn. I have several pages of material I want to present at this time, but unfortunately I don't think we have the time for that. On behalf of all the judges from the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Washington, I want to thank Gonzaga University School of Law, and especially Dean Korn, for graciously hosting this 7th annual Judge Quackenbush lecture series. I won't delay these proceedings any longer because I trust our speaker today will provide us a dynamic and surprising insight into the current election year. And with that said, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Judge Shea, who will introduce our guest speaker today. Judge Shea.
Thank you, Tom. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who's had a long and distinguished career of public service. Ann Ravel was nominated to the Federal Election Commission by President Obama in 2013, and she received what is among the rarest accolades. She was approved unanimously by the United States Senate. For that alone, she deserves all of our respect. She joined the commission that year and served as the chair in 2015 and vice chair in 2014. And during her time there, as well as her time in earlier public service, she was always about the business of transparency in government. And to her credit, she established a beta site. If you go to the beta FEC site, that's beta.fec.gov, you'll see a website that's designed to inform the public in a very user-friendly way, both the look and feel of the website. I visited this morning, and I just wanted to mention that it's just a wonderful way of telling the people about government, and it makes it possible for them to learn a good deal about the work of the Federal Election Commission. But that's not the only thing that she's done in public service by way of transparency. She was at Santa Clara County in the counsel's office, became the county counsel for Santa Clara County, and in that position from 1998 till 2009, she, as you know, represented the elected officials of that county and provided the advice on state political matters. But she also established, which is consistent with her pattern of public service, groundbreaking programs in elder abuse litigation, educational rights, and consumer litigation on behalf of that county and its community. She left there to go to the Justice Department, where she served in the Civil Rights Division prior to returning to under Obama, and then went to California again, where she was appointed by Governor Brown to the California Fair Political Practice Commission. And in that place, she also created a network, a web-based center for sharing information on campaign finance. Prior to that time and before her time at the county counsel's office, she was, in 2007, by the State Bar of California, named Public Attorney of the Year for her contributions to public service. She was elected to the Board of Governors for the State Bar of California, a member of the Judicial Council of the State of California, and chair of the Commission on the Judicial Nominees Evaluation. In all of those roles, as you can see, she was about the business of making government better and of ensuring that the public was served. She has all of those distinctions, but she has one additional one that none of our other prior speakers have ever had. She is actually a member by clerkship of the Eastern District of Washington. Since her son, Gabriel Ravel, himself, a marvelous attorney now in California, working in government in Sacramento, with some very responsible position, in a responsible position. He clerked for me several years ago, and that's how I came to know Ms. Ravel, whom I have the greatest respect for. Please join me in welcoming Ann Ravel.
Thank you very much, Judge Shea, and honorable judges, Dean Horn, members of the bar and students. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here to speak at the 7th Annual Justin L. Quackenbush Lecture, and I'm particularly honored because we are in the presence of Judge Quackenbush, and it's very meaningful for me to be here. I'm also because I am related to the court by clerkship, although I was never good enough for a clerkship, I really do feel a lot of warmth, both for Judge Shea and also for Spokane, because it was extremely important part of my son's life. In fact, probably the most important part after law school. And frankly, I'm really excited about it because it was Judge Shea who taught him how to be a really good lawyer, how to be thoughtful, how to be ethical, and more than anything, how to give to the community. And he, I know, is so well respected by Gabriel because of how much he cares about this school, about the community of Spokane, and about the bench and bar. So thank you so much, Judge Shea. My experience, though, on the FEC has been a little different. Let's put it that way. And actually, it has caused me to be very concerned about the state of our democracy. And I'm not alone in that. Today, a vast majority of citizens of every political affiliation are deeply troubled by the state of money in politics and its detrimental impact on our country. In fact, 84% of Americans say that money has too much influence in our political system, and yet most of those people say there's nothing that can be done about it. A 2015 New York Times poll indicated that 85% of the respondents wanted either fundamental changes or a complete overhaul of our existing campaign finance system. Further evidence of the distrust that people are feeling and the anger that people are feeling with our political process, I think, is apparent in the campaign rhetoric that we hear today in this primary. Things such as, you know, those horrible Wall Street multimillionaires or billionaires, and because I'm wealthy, I'm not bought and sold like the others, have seemed to have struck a chord with people who are concerned about a small number of wealthy people who seem to have outsized political power. But people are also angry and frustrated with government itself. And I think, personally, this is for me, my own personal view, that this rhetoric is really counterproductive, and it doesn't do anything to advance meaningful solutions to the issues that we see, but instead is increasing and greater polarization in our country. And even though the rhetoric has captured a lot of the media's attention, statistics actually indicate that a majority of citizens remain disengaged from the political system. This extreme polarization and disengagement, I think, shows a democracy in crisis. And the paralysis of the Federal Election Commission, which is responsible for ensuring the integrity of the electoral process, and also the fact that the United States Supreme Court refuses to acknowledge the value of citizen participation in our political process, have both significantly contributed to this crisis. Government can only be effective when people trust it and when people trust the political process. The FEC itself was established and created after Watergate, and it was specifically intended to restore public trust in government by requiring full disclosure of campaign finance transactions and to encourage participation in politics by protecting the integrity of elections. The Senate Select Committee that drafted the amendment to the Federal Election Campaign Act explicitly stated that the major legislative recommendations relate to the creation of new institutions necessary to safeguard the electoral process. This is a really important role. The FEC should be a leader in rebuilding public confidence in our political system. Instead, it's broken and ineffective. And at its worst, I think it's responsible for some of the campaign behavior that we see today that is most disheartening. We're seeing a growing trend of lawlessness because the commission doesn't adhere to or enforce any of the existing campaign finance laws except the most insignificant ones. Campaigns and Washington lawyers who represent them know that there are no consequences for violations, and this has led to many of the problems that we now see in our political process. Obviously, the FEC has an obligation to enforce campaign finance laws, particularly those that have been upheld by the federal courts. The Supreme Court and many lower federal courts have affirmed the very parts of law that are most important to our electoral process, and those are two that the Supreme Court has affirmed: disclosure of all sources of political spending and the prohibition of coordination between candidates and those groups that are making independent expenditures. Unfortunately, 3 out of the 6 FEC commissioners who regularly vote as a bloc don't agree with the purpose of the FEC or the laws it's tasked to enforce. And since 4 votes are required to do just about anything at the FEC, I say it even takes 4 votes to go to the bathroom there. I mean, literally cannot do anything. It's possible for this bloc to continually undermine the effectiveness of the agency in both large and small ways. One example of this is that since before I came, we haven't had a general counsel because there's no agreement. There's no ability to have a lawyer who's representing the agency. In a particularly blatant admission, a commissioner who actually left right before I got on the commission said publicly, quote, "I'm not enforcing the law as Congress passed it. I plead guilty as charged." I mean, those of you who are law students here, just know that doesn't comport with the ethical obligations of lawyers. Just know that. And you know, while the bloc that I mentioned does manifest itself by party, the divide on the commission is not partisan. It's ideological. The People who defend the FEC's dysfunction claim that the agency was intended to do nothing. And they hide behind Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United to say that we have to now have sensitivity going forward in enforcing what remains of campaign finance law because the court might strike it down. They also say that the commission has no authority to require disclosure because Congress didn't pass the Disclose Act, which would have required actually even more disclosure. And none of these are further from the truth. The Supreme Court's recent decisions explicitly rely on the enforcement of disclosure laws and the regulation of coordination. Even Justice Scalia, in his concurring opinion in Doe versus Reed, noted that requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. Congress charged the commission with enforcing all campaign finance laws, including disclosure, and it's our obligation to do so. And it's also utter nonsense to say that because the FEC has a 6-member commission and no more than 3 can be of one political party, that it was meant to stalemate. It's nonsense. I mean, Congress would never have established a disclosure and enforcement agency right after the Watergate scandal to do nothing. Instead, what Congress sought to do was to ensure a balance in the Commission's enforcement of the laws, which makes a lot of sense. And for many years, the FEC actually functioned as intended. There was rarely block voting. Commissioners believed in the purpose of the agency. But now we've reached the point where even the mere suggestion of enforcing the law has become taboo for some of my fellow commissioners. This week, one of my fellow commissioners, actually wrote a statement saying that a minority vote to investigate alleged violations of the law, even when it failed, chills speech and is therefore insidious. One example of this failure to effectively enforce the law is in coordination between candidates and super PACs. The Supreme Court has said because one of the only bases remaining for campaign finance laws is if there is quid pro quo corruption. And the court has said that if the candidate and the independent group are coordinating, then it risks quid pro quo corruption. So there cannot be this. But our commission has ignored the clear mandate from Congress by creating loopholes to allow coordination. Candidates have become increasingly intertwined with and reliant on single candidate super PACs. Super PACs now conduct many of the traditional campaign activities that candidates have traditionally done. We see a profusion of single candidate super PACs in this election that appear to be coordinating with the candidates, controlling, running campaigns, setting up, events, and the candidate just shows up. And the FEC has specifically permitted a candidate to attend a super PAC fundraiser, speak, ask for money, even if that fundraiser only consists of 2 people in the room, which I wouldn't normally call a fundraiser. The commission has also authorized a candidate's campaign consultant and congressional chief of staff to solicit unlimited sums of money for a super PAC supporting just that candidate. This unbelievable amount of coordination that the commission permits is probably best shown by the failure of the commission to even investigate where a candidate's mother ran a super PAC expressly supporting her daughter's candidacy. But the FEC didn't think that was enough to give rise to possible coordination. The bloc has even refused to clarify outdated rules to even account for the existence of super PACs. We haven't done any rules about super PACs. In fact, we haven't done very many rules at all in the last 5 or 6 years because we can't agree. The bloc has also refused to require disclosure by independent expenditure groups, even though the Supreme Court unequivocally upheld disclosure as another protection against corruption. We all know about the scourge of dark money in our campaigns. More than 4 times as much dark money has been spent at this point in the campaign as was spent at the same time in 2012. Bloomberg recently reported that about 2/3 of the money spent funding election advertising this campaign season is funded by dark money groups that don't disclose their donors. But the FEC hasn't enforced the unambiguous law which requires organizations whose major purpose is election activity to register as political committees and then have to disclose their donors. In a recent case that we had, and this case is, if you want to read something astounding, you can look up this case on our website. It's the Commission on Hope, Growth, and Opportunity, which we all think sounds wonderful. But that organization spent $4.77 million, at least 85% of its yearly budget, on political ads to influence the 2010 elections. Clear ads, advocacy ads. They even, when we asked for documents, they destroyed them. The commission wouldn't even investigate that clear transgression. And the result, of course, is that the public has been deprived of information about who was behind the political messages in that case. And frankly, we're never going to have another case where we have so much evidence that this was clearly a political committee and the commission split 3-3. This is a far cry from the Supreme Court's vision of a campaign finance system that pairs independent expenditures with effective disclosure. The Federal Disclosure Agency is actually encouraging the proliferation of dark money. As Justice Kennedy, who, as you know, was the author of Citizens United, said recently at Harvard Law School, in my own view, what happens with money in politics is not good. Disclosure of who is financing elections is an answer. And then he went on to admit, but that's not working the way it should. That's an understatement. Another recent development that happened at the commission that encourages the proliferation of dark money is a new way of funneling money without identifying donors. And it's the treatment of contributions that are made through limited liability corporations. The law clearly prohibits someone from making a contribution through a conduit. They have to make contributions in their own name. Yet, the bloc at the FEC declined to pursue 5 cases in the last couple of weeks in which donors made contributions to super PACs by setting up single-member limited liability corporations in order to make those contributions. Literally set them up for the purpose of making the contribution, and then they ended the existence of the LLC. In fact, in one of the cases, one of the donors actually admitted that he set it up solely for the purpose of disguising his identity because he didn't want his name to be known. And yet, we were unable to find that that was a violation of the law. Insiders, as I indicated, have long known about this disgraceful state of affairs at the FEC. Candidates and elected officials are aware, and I've been told this by campaign lawyers in Washington, D.C. The candidates come to them and say, we know they're never going to do any enforcement, so why can't we skirt the law? And so they know they're not going to be held accountable at all, or at the most, it's going to be a slap on the wrist. In fact, the fines have gone down by about 90% in the last few years. I think the American public and those candidates who actually want to follow the law deserve better. What's going on at a federal agency that has such significant power undermines our notion of fairness and justice, and that everyone will be held accountable for breaking the law. The Brennan Center in New York, that does a lot of work on voting and campaign finance, reported lack of enforcement is driving the political trend where undisclosed donors contribute millions of dollars to back shadow campaigns. Congress and the FEC have consistently failed to act while the current system has been dismantled. And a lot of people blame Citizens United and, decry the total amount of money, the large amount of money in campaigns. I have to say, it's the amount of money, it does actually not trouble me, because money's needed for candidates to convey their views to the voters and to obtain and to retain office. But I think the problem stems from the Commission's paralysis and the court decisions that have altered our system so that candidates are under constant pressure to raise money from unaccountable outside groups. Leveling the playing field is off the table as a value justifying campaign finance laws. The Supreme Court has clearly rejected the democratic ideal of ensuring that all citizens have an equal voice in affecting election outcomes, as if speech is only for those who can afford it rather than for all people. I always have to think of, at the time, not too long after Citizens United, a cartoon came out, I think it was in the New Yorker, and no offense to judges, but it shows judges who are clearly the Supreme Court in robes getting out of a limo, and they see a homeless man kind of lying by the bridge, and they say to him, "We just want to assure you that you are free to spend as much money as you want on an election campaign." And these decisions have resulted in the rise of super PACs, the dark money groups, which really do give only a few people in this country a very outsized influence on public policy. The New York Times last fall, I don't know if you all saw it, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It was kind of a low blow a little bit, I thought, because they had pictures of the homes of all these families in Florida. But they said that just 158 families and the businesses they own contributed nearly half of the early money raised to support presidential candidates. And most of that money, the New York Times said, went to candidates who pledged policy positions that were substantially different from about 2/3 of Americans. And just recently, the Washington Post reported that close to half of the money raised by super PACs for the 2016 election came from just 50 mega donors and their relatives. Last year, there was a study by two political scientists, Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, who concluded that economic, this is their words, elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial impacts on U.S. government policy, while mass-based groups and average citizens have little or no influence. They found that elites are not only able to shape the issues that policymakers consider, but they also influence the policy outcomes on contested issues. And the hurdles to participation in political discourse, or even to run for office, is very difficult for those who aren't wealthy or connected to people who are wealthy. And that's one of the other sort of problems that has arisen because of super PACs. There was a statistic a couple of years ago that super PACs were funded by approximately, 95% of white males, and that's where the money went. And so it's much more difficult because of the high cost of actually running for office, that it's much more difficult for women and minorities and others who don't have money to run for office. And because campaigns now limit their targeting of campaign messages through micro-targeting, they know so much about everybody. You can micro-target from one home to the next on the TV shows, that they are actually only targeting those people that they know are either likely voters or likely contributors. And because of that, large numbers of mostly poor and minority voters aren't being engaged at all by campaigns. And this is resulting in what is a very low trust in government. Today, a mere 19% of Americans responded positively that they trusted government in a poll that's been given since the 1950s. And the other time that was the lowest was at 34% that said they trusted government, and that was right after Watergate. Trust in government is really critical because it's a measure of how strongly people feel that government is going to work in their best interest and that it's going to respond to their needs. And when trust is lacking, studies have shown that people can decide that government itself is a problem and voter turnout is low, and people just generally have a distaste for their elected officials. Well, we're seeing that now. The 36% voter turnout in the last election was the lowest since World War II. And I'm from California, so forgive me for giving California examples, but in some ways they're particularly striking. Only 28% of registered Latinos turned out in 2014. And young voters there, practically non-existent. About 8% of Californians 18 to 24 voted in 2014. In fact, one political commentator responded to this pitiful number by saying, in California, an 18 or 19-year-old was more likely to be arrested that year than to actually vote in one of the statewide elections. And in a recent Harvard Institute youth poll, only about 1/3 of young people say that they believe their vote will make a difference. One poll has indicated that over 80% of people don't bother voting because they believe their vote has no significance compared to the influence of super PACs. And I've seen this firsthand. Last summer, I went to speak to a room full of congressional interns. And congressional interns, they're all the way from high school to graduate school. They go to work on the Hill. Who would be more interested in political issues, but congressional interns. But at the end of my talk, which was somewhat similar to this, a bunch of them raise their hands and say, I don't bother voting. Why bother? It doesn't make a difference. It makes no difference. And, you know, nationwide, people who are the poorest and the most impacted by policies that don't favor their interests don't vote at all. Elected officials know this, and they make policy decisions accordingly. There was an interesting article in the New York Times last year that quoted an advisor to Senator McConnell, who openly admitted in the article to the reporter that the state's Obamacare gains wouldn't help Democrats because people on Medicaid don't vote. And, you know, not only do they not vote, but people are also not contributing to campaigns. And while there's been a big amount of press coverage about how much money Bernie Sanders is getting from small donors, actually the number of small donors in this country has gone down. The total number of small donors in 2014 declined by 11% from the previous midterm. And the number of people who contribute to a campaign is actually a really important, strong indicator of political engagement. And of course, we also know there's abundant evidence that people have lost faith in their elected officials. One of my favorites, a study about Congress from a couple of years ago, found that people think more highly of cockroaches and colonoscopies than Congress. And of course, trust of the legislative branch has dropped from 47% in 2008 to 28% in 2014, and it's even lower today. And, you know, we can all give excuses for the reason that Congress is held in such low esteem, because they failed to legislate, number one, and they're really polarized. But the approval of state government, which this really troubles me because it's always been at much higher approval ratings, but approval of state government has dropped 10 percentage points since 1997. And other institutions like parties that used to function to encourage local political participation aren't working in that way. Parties, and there's been a lot written about this, parties claim that they've been weakened a lot by McCain-Feingold, and mostly also by the fact that super PACs now are, as I indicated, sort of taking on the role of parties, and so parties have a much lesser role. And that is true, but in 2015, the esteem for parties was so low that 60% of the people thought a third party was needed. And, you know, in California, I recently saw in the Sacramento Bee, they were saying that by the next election, the number of independents is going to outnumber, certainly, the number of Republicans in California by quite a bit, and be very close to the number of people registered as Democrats. So it's really shifting. And also, I mean, as I said, adding to voter disengagement is the lack of transparency in our elections. Dark money hasn't only increased in this election cycle, but it's crept into state and local campaigns, including school board and local judicial races as well. There's a lot of dark money in judicial races. And many studies have been done that indicate that people tend to feel a greater sense of trust in government when there is disclosure. It gives them the tools to vote, and they feel like they're more part of the government and of the political system, and are disassociated from government when they feel like there's not transparency. And politics, I think, is one of the most powerful ways for people to have an impact on their lives, to feel like they have some control. So, you know, we need to really be concerned about the effective citizen disengagement, which goes beyond voting, beyond contributing. I think we risk, given the dynamic of having a permanent class of outsiders. And people who are disassociated from the system are more likely to have little respect for the law. The economist Joseph Stiglitz recently wrote in a book, "Effective government requires shared action, and trust is necessary for shared action. Without it, acceptance of the law and reliance, the reliance that business depends on, such as for adherence to contracts, will break down." And of course, low trust in government undermines the effectiveness of government itself. Effective government requires legitimacy, and only then will people accept our rules and government decisions. But let me not just leave you with doom and gloom. Are you feeling good? Actually, I do think that the answer is to restore trust and confidence in our political processes and government. Of course, it's at the most basic level, we have to enforce the law. We have to bring campaign spending out of the shadows. And the FEC really should be comprised of people who actually believe in the mission of the agency. But we also have to figure out ways to get people more civically engaged. And I really, really firmly believe this needs to be a priority for this country. And actually, President Obama has said that what he wants to do after he leaves office is to be involved in civic engagement. He's copying me, of course, so I think he recognizes the issues. And I think we have to consider tax credits, vouchers, such as what they have in Seattle, small donor matches to level the playing field, and a way to do things, however creative they could be, to encourage our legislators to work for all voters, not just the ones who are making large contributions. We should expand membership and participation in local organizations, expand the political arena by increasing opportunities for women, minorities, and the lower and middle classes to run for office. Parties do still, I think, have an important role in this. And government needs to be open to participation, individual participation in policy making instead of, I worked at local government for a long time. I saw a lot of people come to the podium and have their 3 minutes, and that was it. And actually, people should be able to participate more in the actual functioning of government and feel like they're part of it. And government needs to be more inclusive. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about technology and how technology can make a difference. Young people, while they tend not to be involved, we all know they're always on their iPhones or whatever, any other cell phone. There's, I guess, more than 2.6 billion smartphones in the world. And also there are like 1.55 billion active Facebook users who actually talk to each other about politics. All of these tools and others, there's a lot of new tech companies that are working on trying to bring people into the democratic processes. And that should all be encouraged. And we have to use technology. Judge kindly talked about my interest, and I am really interested in this, and I think having more government information online, easily available, easily accessible, will make people feel more included. But I don't think technology is the only answer. I think there needs to be sort of personal relationships with people. Those of you who are here who are students, I hope every one of you votes, and I hope, and you all, everyone, and I hope that you encourage other people to vote, and not just in the federal elections, in the state and local elections too. Down ballot elections are really important, and what happens in your local community can actually have an impact on federal policy. I've seen it. I think people are paying attention to this, particularly in the campaign finance arena. But we all need to expect more from the people that we elect and the people that we've entrusted to uphold our laws to make the change that's needed in campaign finance. So thank you all.
We now have time for a few questions.
Okay, sir.
So you mentioned that the enforcement of the election law is really impossible with the FEC. What would be a solution to change that when the people who are in charge of changing election law are the ones who can really vote power?
Right. Well, number one, I do think there are some bills in Congress that aren't going anywhere for probably some of the reasons you've talked about, but I do think if people make that a priority and tell their congresspeople that they should need to think about these things, that it might make a difference. Also, I think that the problem at the FEC has to do with what has evolved in the process for appointments. I am actually the only member of the FEC, that's in a term, and also that was actually appointed by the president. The others were nominated by either the majority leader or the minority leader of the Senate. And it's, by statute, they're presidential appointees, but because actually, for those of you who are West Wing fans, season 1, it's, I believe, episode 19, is about this very subject. And President Carter tried to appoint to the FEC directly, and the Senate refused to confirm. So I would not have gotten my unanimous consent. So it's evolved in that way, but what happens is that because Congress is so divided and so polarized, that the appointees are people who will do as they're told, pretty much. And that should change. I think that the next president, could have a blue ribbon committee that would nominate or suggest people who it might be difficult for either party to reject. And they should actually have people on the commission who believe in the law. That's a novel concept.
Thank you for coming around. Two questions, if I may. First, to clarify the previous question, does the existence of the FEC in some way preclude action by, say, the Justice Department to bring cases before the judiciary litigate these? And then the second question is, have our efforts to limit the amount of money going into campaigns kind of put us essentially a hoist our own petard, such that campaigns aren't controlling how the money is spent anymore? And would it be better to have candidates responsible for their own list?
Yeah. As to your first question, we have concurrent jurisdiction over criminal matters, and so the DOJ could take criminal cases. Interestingly, and they recently have, they did one on coordination about 6 months ago or so. It's much more difficult, obviously, to prove criminal cases. And a lot of the complaints are made to the FEC because we should be doing what we're not doing. And there's a weird aspect to this that I don't want to go into so much detail, except that my fellow commissioners also do not want to share any information with the Department of Justice.
I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Okay.
Is there any role for the FEC to bring uniformity in presidential elections? I don't think we vote on as a nation as the president. And it's no surprise people are frustrated with the system. You see people waiting in lines to vote and never get a chance to vote.
Right.
Here in Washington State, we take it for granted how the rest of our system is. I get a ballot in the mail, fill it out, you see how it's going to be. And our percent of voting is about 80% of Washington State. Is there any way for the FEC to bring that idea to the whole nation, at least with respect?
Yeah. The FEC does not have authority over the voting processes. In fact, most of the voting processes, unless there are, clear civil rights violations, which are enforced by the Justice Department, are local. They're up from there for each state to enforce. There is a group that for many years Congress never appointed anybody to it, the Election Assistance Commission, and that now has enough members on it, but their real focus was the Help America Vote Act, so after hanging chads and the like, so they're much more involved with voting machines rather than much relating to voting processes. So,
Please join me in
thank you.
thanking the commission. It's now my privilege to introduce Judge Quackenbush for some of his remarks.
I will be brief. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for taking your time and expressing these concerns that are in the minds of so many of us during this current season. And thank you, Judge Shea, for bringing Commissioner Ravel to us for this great food for thought message. Thank you, Gonzaga. Thank you, Dean Korn, for this presentation. As I listen to discussions such as that set forth by the Commissioner, I often pause and reflect about all the problems that we have in our country. But I also pause and reflect upon the statement of Sir Winston Churchill, who in the debate about the evils or positive aspects of democracy remarked in rebuttal to his opponent who was pointing out all the difficulties of democracy. Sir Winston said, "Yes, I guess it really isn't a very good system until you compare it to all the other systems that have been tried in the history of the world." And we are fortunate to be one of those countries. I see many friends here. I look forward to talking with you, and thank you all for coming.